there was total darkness, and they said they fired one shot, and then you're seeing now bullet holes in the walls, and the blood is down, which suggests that perhaps she was shot lying down. And then I find a spent cartridge, which I think they left in a hurry and they didn't. So suddenly there's a hail of bullets and not one. And then you find that the lady was also buried quickly in a shallow grave, and the post-mortem report says she died of a heart attack.
Oh, gosh.
So suddenly you realize something is going on, and you start investigating. Long story short, it was discovered there was a cover-up of a pathologist report, and the investigation was now open because of the actions that we did as journalists, and eventually the perpetrators were sent to jail.
From Cairo to Cape Town, Lagos to Lamu. 54 nations, one continent, countless perspectives. Hi, I'm Waweru Njoroge.
Hi, I'm Okoh.
Welcome to Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens. This is the podcast where we unpack power, policy, people, and the paradoxes that define our time. With history, with deliberate commitment to context. This isn't punditry, it's perspective. It's not a briefing, it's a reframing, and it starts right here.
Across Africa, climate is no longer a distant scientific debate. It is shaping food systems, security dynamics, migration flows, mining contracts, and political legitimacy. What looks like drought becomes displacement. What looks like extraction becomes instability. What looks like policy becomes power.
And the story we tell about these shifts matters. Narrative shapes capital, it shapes foreign engagement, it shapes who is blamed and who is absolved.
Our guest today has stood at that intersection nearly a decade at the BBC News, reporting across East Africa and the Horn of Africa, now shaping climate and environmental storytelling across Anglophone Africa at Greenpeace.
Ferdinand Omondi joins us to explore a harder question. When environmental stress becomes governance crisis, who controls the frame and who absorbs the consequences?
So welcome to Panel 54, Ferdinand. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Karibu Sana. You've reported from conflict zones, environmental front lines, and communities living at the sharp edge of climate change. What experiences shaped you as an investigative journalist willing to enter difficult terrain?
The list is very long. And, when you go to the front lines and see some of the underreported stories or the misreported stories and what exactly they represent, it sticks with you and you always want to tell the truth. And some of the most illuminating stories that got me into investigative journalism sometimes were also centered on justice and human rights. For instance, the case of Kwekwe Mwandaza in 2014. It wasn't a climate story, but it was this 14-year-old girl who was shot by police. And if you remember that time, the Inspector General of Police himself came forward and said that they were hunting down for a criminal, and this lady accosted them in the middle of the night with a machete, and there were 8 policemen, and they were not, and so they had to kill her in self-defense. Now, this is in Kwale, and when stories like that occur and the IG speaks, people say, okay, they must be right. And then it dies down. But I am in Mombasa as a reporter then, so I tell myself, and there's a journalist says, my colleague was writing for the Standard newspaper, says, I'm going to Kwekwe's home, do you want to come with me? Yeah, let's go and see what's happening. And so we go there and we just start asking simple questions, what really happened? Then now we realize that it was in the dead of the night. The uncle they were looking for wasn't there. There was total darkness, and they said they fired one shot, and then you're seeing now bullet holes in the walls, and the blood is down, which suggests that perhaps she was shot lying down. And then I find a spent cartridge, which I think they left in a hurry and they didn't. So suddenly there's a hail of bullets and not one. And then you find that the lady was also buried quickly in a shallow grave, and the post-mortem report says she died of a heart attack.
Oh, gosh.
So suddenly you realize something is going on, and you start investigating. Long story short, it was discovered there was a cover-up of a pathologist report, and the investigation was now open because of the actions that we did as journalists. And eventually the perpetrators were sent to jail. The head of DC, and they're serving 7-year sentences, maybe 2014. I think maybe some of them are about coming out. Should have been a murder case, but they got manslaughter. There was a sense of justice. But then that triggers something in you, that are we really telling the correct story? In climate-related issues, I've been to Somalia, and this is an area that, for 3 consecutive rainy seasons in a semi-arid area or an arid area, it spells disaster. Yep. So communities are moving out from one place to another. What used to be a 5-kilometer walk in search of water and pasture becomes 50 kilometers. And the further you go, now you have to cross borders. And then that now brings tension to the communities, and the government saying there's too many Somalis coming in, and they're coming in, the Al-Shabaab, and suddenly security issue. But you're not questioning the real reason why these people are moving. Their livestock are dying. They cannot feed their families. They cannot drink water. So it's a survival thing. But we have conflated and separated environment issues and climate issues as if environment issues live in a silo. If you cannot eat and if you cannot feed yourself, you will be desperate and you will want to eat. And that is how it becomes an issue after you have stolen from your neighbor or you've gone and fought over the last few drops of water in a well. And even when you go to places like the border between Ethiopia and Kenya and you look at what happens there and you hear the Boranas have crossed over the other side, and so these bloody Ethiopians are invading and you throw in police in there. But why are they crossing? It is a survival issue caused by the climate crisis for which those people are not even responsible to begin with. And they do not know that they're suffering because of a result of extractive policies that has led this continent to be the biggest recipients of the damages we are seeing. And so our job in Greenpeace Africa is trying to make that sense. In the newsroom, I was able to say what is going on and why is it important. Now I am explaining who is responsible and what should be done.
So if we're looking at some point, environmental stress stops being about weather, as you had mentioned, right? And it becomes about stability.
Yes.
When does climate stress become a security crisis rather than an environmental one?
As soon as it happens, it is supposed to be a security crisis.
Okay.
The problem is we frame it as an environmental issue until it blows out of proportion, then we see it as a crisis. Take the case of 2012 Tana River clashes.
Yes.
We get a story that somebody has a farmer's boy has killed a bull that strays into their farm. We ran a quick story and then the next day the farmer kills this boy. I'm not okay, what is going on? The following day, the villagers of these people in the farm go to the village where this herdsman is, and they kill, burn their houses. Wow. These people retaliate.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what happened in the Tana River clashes of 2012. It started with that small, innocuous issue of livestock being killed. By the time it was done, over 100 people had been killed and more than 100,000 had been displaced. How it was framed initially was it is a battle between the Ormas and Pokomos. But since it was an also election year, people were sensitive not to ethnicize it. So they say it's between farmers and pastoralists. But then that became a crisis only after people had died, hundreds. But the real story behind here was the scarcity of resources. What drove this farmer all the way to drive their livestock into a farmer's, this herder to drive their livestock into a farmer's land to feed, or what they say, this is grass for my livestock, and that is what they believe. And so when you start to address these issues, but you look at it from the political angle without addressing the real issue, which is that there's been shortage of rainfall in Tana River. It is one of the poorest. These people struggle to maintain their livestock. The death of a camel, of a livestock, that is what keeps them alive. That is what takes their children to school. That is what, takes their people to hospital. Same thing for the and I think we made a mistake then, even as journalists, because people say my people perish for lack of knowledge. That is how we frame it, because that was the overlying discussion, and nobody really sat down to ask what really is the problem. And so I feel that sometimes this is deliberate. by policy to frame such issues of resource scarcity as environmental, because then you cluster it into page 6, 7 of a magazine and not the front line that it is. And that if you choose to address it, there'll be ultimately costs to it, which are inevitable to make sure that there's justice and equity. And that is not something that is usually front and center in government and international policy.
Well, looking at that kind of resource conflict, sometimes it's whittled down to geography.
Yes.
But maybe it's a little bit more than that. Are governments treating resource conflict as adaption policy, or simply as policing over problems?
As it is right now, I think across Africa, what we are seeing is that governments are increasingly policing adaptive crisis and environmental crisis, especially where cross-community conflicts are concerned. And that is the biggest mistake that they're making. If you look at what happened in the borders when, pastoralists were crossing over from Ethiopia to Kenya, or what happened in there, you send in police and you put in barriers and put in curfews and you put in the military and you say, 6 p.m. you will be in bed. But you cannot police a drought. Okay. You cannot police water shortage. And so until you resolve that, then it becomes a problem. You need to look at if there's a problem between Boranas in Ethiopia and Kenya. So what is the problem? Is a water shortage. And by the way, the communities there actually managed to bypass governments, because when you realize these people are not resolving it and we are scrambling for this water, they came together and decided on a water sharing policy. But that is what the people should be addressing, the root cause. In conflict transformation, we are taught that, listen, when two people are fighting over a tree, you do not ask who owns this tree. You will say, I own this tree, and you'll say, I own this tree. But ask, why do you want this tree? Why you claim this tree? It is possible that you want it because the barks provide herbs that treat you. It is possible that all you need is the shade from that tree. And you worry that if he claims ownership, you won't have the shade. But if he said, listen, if you both can have this tree, lie under this shade as much as you want, take as much back as you want, as long as you let it renew, will you both be agreeable to that? People say, yeah, and resolve it. But if you want to decide whose tree is it, you will never resolve. And government always does that. They now put soldiers to police that tree to make sure that you both don't kill yourselves in there, but you're not resolving the underlying issues. And so you need to have adaptive strategies. If there is a shortage of water, are you digging enough wells? If there is conflict around resources, how do you sharing it? If a place constantly floods like Budalangi and so on, are we putting early warning systems to be able to prevent these people from all that suffering? If there's a shortage of farming, how are we adapting our farming strategies to deal with the current climate?
Okay, so from that perspective then, in terms of preparedness, if I was to look at the broader picture and look at Africa as a continent, are we prepared for large-scale internal climate migration into already crowded cities?
No. No. Listen, look, take the case, and now we look broadly. Let's start with Nairobi. We've had devolution, which the aim of which was to distribute resources and economies and so on. And the CBD was supposed to be expanded. But what are we doing? Look at Kilimani, for instance. It is turning into pipeline Promax. We are violating environmental impact assessments. We are flooding already populated areas with huge floods. Thousands and thousands of people are getting crowded into spaces which they did not plan for. Nairobi wasn't built for this population. You are not expanding the drainage. You are not expanding the roads. And so they are all squeezing in. And then we are looking at the potential drop in quality of life and also health crisis. There is just one cholera outbreak away from Nairobi being a disaster. And with all the flooding that happens because our drainage system is wasted, that becomes a problem. I think the World Bank projects that by 2050 there'll be over 50 million climate migrants, and it could be as high as 113 million. Moving from rural to urban migration. And if you look at migration studies here in Kenya, is that across the world, is that if rural-urban migration happens, the reverse almost always becomes impossible, because that's where the opportunities are. Nigeria, now that we look continentally, Lagos is also under threat. It is an exploding population, but it is a sea-line city. And because of climatic changes, the sea is seeping into fresh water sources because the water levels are rising. So the already shortage crisis that we have there is a problem. Are we expanding electricity supply? Are we expanding infrastructure? Are we making these places better for people? We are not doing that. that because the policies and the politics just favors us looking for short-termism. So in the long term, there's going to be an implosion if you don't step back and say, okay, how do we help this? Ndakaini Dam, which serves for 80% of the population as it is right now, is already constrained. Beyond that, the changing climate already says that there have been several years where it doesn't even have sufficient water. And if you're already having water rationing right now when we're at about a population of 6-7 million, what happens when you get to 13 million?
Well, I mean, you have countries like Ethiopia who've been very insistent with GERD that we've seen that will essentially take care of communities way up the chain.
Yeah.
Is that forward thinking? Or is it political in nature?
Oh, this is very tricky, and it's important that you raised it, because Ethiopia, for me, I think is a classic situation where you are solving a problem by creating another one. The scramble for water resources and rivers, and that's why we say climate crisis is always a security crisis. Ethiopia, because of the colonial laws that existed that were negotiated by the British government, means that Egypt and the downstream cities are the ones, downstream countries are the ones that have primary right to the source of the Nile. So, and that is why Kenya, and people don't even see that Kenya right now cannot have mega dam projects around the Lake Victoria because Egypt retains a veto about what Kenya can do it. And that is why as soon as the Grand Renaissance Dam was being built, Egypt said, you cannot do this because you're threatening us. And they have a reason to think about it because that is a country that is already facing water pressures, and 90% of the supply comes to the River Nile. But Ethiopia also have a right to it. And so we might want to laud the production of over 5,000 megawatts of electricity for industrialization. But the problem of these huge projects as well is that they also come with their same measure of injustices, environmental destruction, displacement of the people, changing of the way of life. And these voices all around the dam who had concerns, their voice never came out because of also the environment in Ethiopia. So now we are looking at a place where Ethiopia and Sudan and Egypt could very nearly go to war over this dam. And then you have to ask yourself, so was it possible to all these billions of dollars to just put up mini grids, sustainable mini grids that can still supply electricity across the country as you try and resolve this? And while Kenya has also technically rejected these colonial laws that prevent them, but you see when they want to start a mega project like Galana Kulalu, they will go down to the coasts to Tana River. They cannot dare touch River Nzoia or River Yala because Egypt will say, we're going to come for you.
Right.
So that is the relationship that is always, we're trying to look forward sustainability, and sometimes these grand projects
are not
ultimately do not become sustainable.
They're not sustainable. That's interesting, because if you can get into water and minerals and the new Scramble.
Yes.
The green transition requires minerals. That's not a secret. Water scarcity is intensifying. Just from some of the things that you've just said. Extraction is accelerating. Everybody is still courting this African girl. The stakes are structural.
Yes.
Are we witnessing a new scramble for Africa driven by the energy transition rather than fossil fuels?
Oh man.
You can take a breath because it looks like
it's listen, was it 1886 Berlin Conference? Subdivided 1884. Subdivided Africa. It was the first Scramble Africa, where they were taking our resources to go and build their economies, and they succeeded very well in that, and they left us death, destruction, displacement, and up to right now people are still fighting for land ownership, and because they simply spread a huge piece of paper and signed off this land and gave the problem to African governments who couldn't solve it, we're facing that injustice. Now the push for critical minerals is the new scramble for Africa. Only now it is clothed in more diplomatic words. Development, cooperation, partnership. But it's the same extractive model where the global north is coming, grabbing our minerals, leaving the land and the fights to us, and then developing themselves. Take the example of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It now owns 70% of the cobalt that is needed for green energy and to power the electric motors and the cell phones. There's probably a piece of DRC in our phones right now as we speak. Comes from the DRC. So technically speaking, and I think the demand for it is going to triple by 2030, DRC should be the new Singapore. We keep speaking about Singapore.
Yeah.
DRC should be the new Singapore. Why is it the most corrupted, the most at risk, and the most volatile? Because there are too many greedy forces trying to take out from there. And some of the worst human rights injustices are also happening in DRC because child labor is involved. What really should be happening right now is that Africa is really positioned to now stop being the victim and say we own this. We have to demand co-sharing. If you are going to extract this, you have to support these people and equip them to do proper mining. You have to make sure some of this money comes back to develop these communities. You have to respect the rights of these communities. But above all, we need to add value to these critical minerals so that they support us. Why are all these industries being... You don't want to build in the USA, you take it to China. Why don't you bring it to DRC? Or if Kinshasa is not safe for you, even bring it to Nairobi. So that Africa is also developing from all this.
Sounds like a leadership problem, though.
It is a leadership problem as well, because the problem with some of the leaders that we have is that when they go there with the begging bowls and forget the leverage that they have. But there's also the element of corruption in it, because at some point you find that these mining companies that come, there's always that hidden shareholder that you do not know about, and they're the decision makers. But I don't want to fully blame also the African leaders. The current legal international structure also sometimes puts us under very incredible stress. IMF will say, for us to help you, you need to make this concession so the country becomes investor friendly. And that element of blackmail has been done. I'll finish this part by saying, look at what Donald Trump said. I have brought peace to the DRC. What I like about Trump, he does not hide the real reasons. We are going to get a lot of minerals from DRC. So, unlike others who caught it behind diplomacy, Trump is saying, I am being selfish about this, and there's no peace in DRC. We all know that, but they already secured the minerals. So, DRC people be damned.
Three things that you've picked up I want to now look at. One of them obviously is the fact that, so why do we even bother with COP? Number one, we don't have to answer that now, but do you see where my concern is about why we have COP and we have all this thing about Global South needs to be, and that then leads to the question about if we are in a position to start negotiating. We still are not, as far as I can see, as a continent, are we able to negotiate from a position of strength, or are we then basically negotiating from fiscal desperation? And then I'll come on to the aspect of Galamsey, but let's start with that, then we look at the illegal mining.
So the concept of illegal mining as it is has also been stapled on some of these are very unfair laws that come. So you said we'll speak about Galamsey, so I'll leave that. But the thing is, African, and that's the problem with the narrative that we are trying to shift, even as I work for Greenpeace Africa, the storytelling that we are not victims anymore. We have the resources and the know-how to be able to demand what it is we want for ourselves. They are coming to Africa because they need something from Africa. And so we can set the rules that if you want this from us, this is what we need. But if we say we are poor, help us, or we are desperate, first of all, it creates fatigue and a level of desperation. And if you tell me, please help me, I am desperate, then now I decide and make the rules. So African leaders need to now come and make a stand and say, you want our critical minerals, these are the rules of engagement. You want to come to extract, you want to bring electricity, we do not want fossil fuels anymore, because you are seeing how that has caused tornadoes in South Africa, how many people, 100,000 that died in Mozambique, how communities are getting displaced. We want wind, we want solar, and you want it to be community owned so that you will make your profits, but the ultimate sustainability and the involvement is there with us Africans, because we also have the manpower. Beyond that, they already agreed through COP, through the Kyoto Protocol, to the Paris Agreement, that yes, we developed as a result of fossil fuels, and we later realized that this is damaging the environment, and so we need to keep this under 1.5, but we also have to establish a loss and damage fund to fund the disaster, to fund all these adaptation needs for Africa. They have already agreed. It is a legally binding treaty.
And yet, seem to be very lackadaisical when it comes to implementing.
It is horrible because now they say we have upwards of 2 trillion that is needed for adaptation needs for the global south. But you only have 300 million. And even when they make that pledge for 300 million, you do not have put enough money in there. You have enough money to bomb nations, and I don't want to go into the politics of that, but you cannot, a fraction of that will meet all the adaptation needs of Africa. And so that is why we keep on going there and say, you made this commitment, please reach it. But what they are giving us is loans again. We don't want loans, we want grants, and they signed it to it. Please implement it. But now again, we are in this kind of world now where international law and treaties don't really matter. It's about who has the biggest nuclear weapon and can threaten you, and that's the leverage which Africa doesn't have. But we have to keep fighting because we simply cannot afford to give up. Giving up meaning losing our livelihoods and our lives.
Okay, extractive economies.
Yes.
Now, I had the opportunity to go to Ghana and happen to have a chat with former President Njoroge.
Yeah.
One of the things we did bring up was the aspect of Galamsey and the Chinese and the illegal mining, which is actually criminalized. Like you said, corruption allows you to get around many things.
Yeah.
But it is also a survival economy from exclusion, rather, right? Is it also a survival economy from exclusion?
It is survival economy based off of exclusion, and you've spoken about Galamsey, and it's very important to bring this up at this stage because it shows what is the patterned problem with the African policies that favors corporates and profiteers ahead of the communities. So they outlawed artisanal mining.
Yes.
But in rural Africa, science shows, research, that it is actually the second or the third largest feeder of those communities. So it's either agriculture and then artisanal mining is number 2. And in spite of the bans which have been put in Ghana, still 75% of the mining there is artisanal. So then the problem isn't the mining, the problem is the illegalization of that mining. Because what you need to do is say this resource is needed. The government needs this gold for its development. But if I have a piece of land which was mine, and that is been a law that is in Kenya, and I farm it and it is mine, and but as soon as I find gold in it, suddenly this land belongs to the government. And you're trying to tell the people, listen, okay, we see where this is now a national resource. Can I be involved in the mining of it?
Sure.
Can you give me the tools and the skills to be able to do this responsibly? Can we establish laws to keep away the middlemen? And when this profit has come out, can a percentage of it come to help these people?
Absolutely. Instead
Instead of transforming these laws to bring community ownership and inclusivity and justice, we just throw the law into it as if this law was created by some amorphous force that cannot do it. And that is why I think Bonnie Kalwale is right. The Kolomani people deserve to be part of that gold rush that is coming in. But the biggest risk, we're saying this national resource, is that you bring a tenderpreneur either from Kenya or again from the global north to manage all this gold, mine it. Meanwhile, once you've displaced people because you want to mine, you've taken off their farming, you've taken off their homes, you will compensate them with $1,000. These people will make $20 million and not even $500,000 will come back to Ikolomani and develop them. How is that justice?
So isn't how it is because of the fact that there is fiscal depression and even desperation? Because people still suffer from poverty. And if somebody makes an offer to you whereby you'll take the bare minimum, you'll take the bare minimum, Ferdinand. These being managed properly.
That is the problem, is that the government is not protecting the people enough. Poverty is a problem, but you don't resolve poverty by exploiting the poor. You resolve poverty by creating opportunities for them. So where there are natural resources that have been realized in these countries, like in Kenya or in Ghana or wherever, you have to look at it and say, then how do we empower these communities to benefit the best from it?
Right.
And there have been cases, 1 or 2, where we have seen successes. Botswana, for instance, and their diamond. They put in a very magnificent structure and they created a board where they sell that, and you can see how Botswana is very successful. They built schools, colleges, hospitals, and one might argue that yes, the population is only 3 million, but there is a model from which people can learn from. That principle is what we want. So it is not something that is impossible to do. If we put aside greed, we can serve the people and benefit from our resources. But the policymakers need to stop being greedy and start thinking about putting the people and the planet.
They're not looking. They don't have a long-term vision in terms of what can actually happen.
know.
It's very myopic, and then I think that might be cycles of the fact that governments change every other 10 years,
Right.
And somebody comes in with a new. But if you had a national, we do have a national plan in terms of how environment is, but then it never seems to take off. It seems to teeter. Then somebody comes and adds something onto it. But anyway, that's government and governance is actually what I wanted to now look at in terms of environmental laws do exist. Yeah, but enforcement often does not.
Yeah.
That's one problem. So EAIs, environmental impact assessments, are they meaningful safeguards or are they just bureaucratic theater?
I would go for bureaucratic theater and the fact that environmental impact assessments, especially in the African context, they have been used as licenses to continue exploiting. Instead of being used as the real safeguards to make sure that it happens. Look at the case of Nairobi, for instance. There is a law that says for you to build your home on riparian land, you have to give, 30 meters?
Yeah.
Why do we have homes built on top of rivers? To the extent where politicians says, okay, you already have this building here, so move the river and not the building.
But then now you have when the building collapses and suddenly you have Serikali to Saidie.
Then Serikali to Saidie. And then now there's the National Construction Authority, there's the National Environmental Management Authority, and the county. All these buildings you see which have problems and falling down and blocking drainages, there is an impact. It is a prerequisite. Who then signs off on this? So you have to ask the questions of what is the role of corruption and expediency in the bastardization of environmental impact assessments. If you already determine that a place like Lamu is very ecologically sensitive, the marine protected life is there, the UNESCO World Heritage Site is there, there are communities surviving off of fishing on the land, and why on earth do you want to license coal over there that activists have to come and shout from the top of their voices for you to stop it? And even that is temporary. Somebody is still considering it.
It's not long term. That's true. And at the same time, we're still looking at foreign companies coming in.
Yes.
And there is ecological damage.
Yeah.
Now, when we see that damage, what real accountability mechanisms exist that are actually followed and implemented?
Outside of a slap on the wrist.
Right.
That's another sigh moment because there's a lot of sad stories about that across the continent. And it's really sad that when these big corporates come to Africa and exploit, they will take the profit and leave you with the damages. And sometimes the only person that benefits are the people who sign off on them coming in and that's why they can drive and own choppers and airplanes and get treatment for several months in Texas and whatever, and the ordinary people suffer. Look at the case of what happened, since we're making this Pan-African, what happened in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, River State, Ogoniland.
Yes.
Shell went there and did the extraction. They took the oil, the shareholders took the profit, the company took the oil, but what was left in the River State? The soil became soaked. With oil. So the soil has been degraded, the water has been poisoned, they can no longer fish, they can no longer farm. The Nigerian government was unable completely to get justice for them. They had to go to the courts in the UK for them to get a judgment that Shell really does have a responsibility. Is a systemic failure of the people we have entrusted protect us, because we are always told that Africa needs to choose between destruction and development, which is a very false narrative fronted by the same profiteers that our governments seek to protect. And that is a huge disgrace.
And we call them rebels, don't we? Look at MEND.
Yes.
MEND essentially became a rebel group because they were fighting for some of the very things that you're talking about in Nigeria.
That is, and by the way, and there's these huge controversies. You remember the story of Ken Saro-Wiwa. Some of the most frontline people who fought this have died as a result of that, and there has been zero accountability. He was subjected to one of the most sham trials in the, and he was hanged. But his biggest crime was fighting for justice that the people of Ogoniland finally might be able to get. Look at the case of here in Uganda and Tanzania, the East African, the pipeline, ECOP. An environmental impact assessment has been done.
Right.
We have seen there is very critical wildlife corridor that is going to be affected. Up to 100,000 people are likely to be displaced. Uganda and Tanzania have signed off on it, and Total Energies is going on with the constructions. What are we doing as a people?
True. As a people, pick up on that actually. As in terms of what you've experienced, are community-led conservation models proving more durable than centralized state approaches?
Yes, and we are always fighting to let communities manage. Listen, even when sustainable development, and that is a word I hate using because it has really been used to greenwash people. Even timber manufacturers and people who cut down timber have something sustainable. And I saw that when I went to do some inspection of where Kenyan timber comes from, and I was surprised that a lot of it comes from the DRC.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, we can whisper, but hey.
You know, and this guy, and I saw, oh, we are a sustainable organization. So I asked the operator, the PR, the business person, how are you sustainable? And they said, no, you know what? I don't know. I was told to put sustainable to it. Anyway, what was the question?
So another question is whether community-led activities,
they have proven to be the best way to actually protect these ecosystems. In the DRC, the forest communities have lived a lot better in harmony with that carbon sink and sustained that forest for many years, and done a far much better job than the government and the carbon credits. Here in the Mau, the Ogiek community, who are now being kicked out to make space for carbon credits, lived in harmony in that forest for generations. We never had that forest being degraded until it was invaded. They fed off the bees, they fed off the trees, they were able to live sustainably. And that is why we are saying that if you want to conserve these places, you want to conserve these waters, you want to conserve these resources, the models already exist. The thing is, we see our solutions as archaic and primitive. But the person bringing in this sustainable solution to you and loading it down over you is trying to extract something. Then they will leave. Once we kick out the Ogiek and they've harvested their carbon credits and that forest disappears and we don't have water tables, they will now want to give you a loan to restore that forest.
Yeah. It's a vicious cycle.
It's a vicious cycle, and so we need to stop it. So once these models have been created and have been seen to be supporting, then now do research and find how do we empower these communities further to do the protection.
Some of these narratives then come out through the media.
Yes.
And who gets to frame the continent, who gets to frame the conversations. Environmental crises intensify and coverage shrinks, unfortunately. But one of the ways that we know already for us to be able to be aware of what goes on is through media. Has environmental reporting become a low priority beat in algorithm-driven newsrooms?
The saddest answer I've had to give, other than the extraction, is that the answer is yes. And there are a lot of factors. Some of them are unavoidable. Some of them are also that ghostly hand of the structures and the billions they have is taking care of this narrative. You've seen what is happening across the world is that media is fast losing advertising, which has gone to social media channels. So in their quest to survive, they have to look, and this has even happened at, well, I've worked for the BBC, I have a lot of respect for it, but as some of the editorial decisions that have been made, there's a huge pressure to do digital first, which is the correct thing to do. But sometimes you wonder whether we are now sacrificing context for virality. Because a way for you to make money and for you to be seen is something that is quick, and so it has to be shock and or immediacy or 6 things you didn't know about this person, number 7 will shock you. And so the climate context will require investigation and time and several months and to go and deliver sometimes does not come out. First of all, there's no funding for that, especially in mainstream media. They are barely struggling to survive. Number 2, you'll find that politics takes sensitive because there's of the drama around it. And then number 3, the corporates involved in the destruction still have the deepest PR pockets. And so their PR budgets sometimes are larger than some of these small island developed states.
So if I was to put it to you this way, to the layman, for example,
yes,
fine, we don't get much coverage in terms of environmental stories.
Yes.
For some, it's very complex. Yeah. For others, it just might be slow.
Yes.
And then the third one is that there's no real villain here, or you might not be able to name them specifically. Could that also be the reason why these stories are not, that coverage is shrinking?
I have a counter response to that. That I think that a lot of journalists are not well equipped to cover environmental stories.
Okay.
There you go.
Because it is, and that is what we try to do in terms of storytelling, that in every kind of story you have to find a human. It is not enough to say that the climate crisis has led to the displacement of several hundred people in northern Kenya. So what? But if you reframe that and says, Halima walks 40 more kilometers in search of water than she did 5 years ago.
You're grounded.
Now you think, okay, what is going on with Halima? And that the well she used to get feed her family from and water dried 4 years ago, and there's no chance. And then you start to extrapolate that and see exactly, people now begin to care. Or if there's a crisis that is happening, and we saw that happened with the Kenya seed law case, when we kept on saying that there's a punitive seed law that is threatening seed sovereignty, nobody cared. But when you say it's saying that your grandmother in Kinangop is at risk of being taken to jail for the offense of sharing and exchanging seeds, which has been a traditional practice for hundreds of years, and the fine is 1 million shillings or 2 years in jail, and they want her to pay 200,000 shillings to certify the seeds which she knows are good for her, people started caring. You remember there's a time last year where there's something like Occupy Machakos law courts at the height of the finance bill protests. People became very angry about injustices because they found relatability. And so in climate storytelling, you have to find relatability. But in the question of the villain, bold journalism demands that you have to name the villain. And maybe that is where a problem is, because very few organizations can name the villains, because the villains are funding those newsrooms.
They are the ones with the deep pockets.
Yes, so you have to say that the Kenya government has lifted the moratorium on logging, which then could bring back the annual loss of 80,000 hectares of forest. Who was the president who was in that government at that time when the moratorium was lifted? Who was the minister that accounted for this? If you are going to allow the mining of coal in Lamu, who are the culprits responsible, and who is this billionaire funding it, and which is this international organization that is responsible for that? Okay, if ECOP is going to go on, who is the CEO of Total at that point who is ignoring the environmental impact assessment? These people must be named. But Total Energies is the sponsor of the African Cup of Nations to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars, and they pump a lot of money into advertisement. And if you want to get part of that slice of cake, you cannot antagonize Total.
Wow. So if that's the looking into the future, who gets to tell the African environmental story? Is it local journalists? Is it international NGOs? Is it government? Who tells the story? Or are we looking at a concert of effort?
It is a concert of effort. But I think the most important people to tell this story are the frontline communities. And we try to do that a lot as Greenpeace Africa, to try, when we go, for instance, to Mpumalanga in South Africa, we empower those communities with spokesperson training and giving them an understanding, because all they will tell us, we have struggles breathing, and our mothers, for some reason, and now there's an increased number of miscarriages, and there's a disproportionate increase in respiratory diseases. So we come in as NGOs to investigate, and then we realize that coal mines in South Africa and the area surrounding those provinces have the most toxic air in the world. And last year, our report showed that 42,000 people die every year as a result of that. So now you're beginning to make that sense. But it is not our role to tell that story. It is for those people to speak out for themselves, but you need to give them a voice. But then the journalists also need to have the courage to go and speak out to that, so that when South Africa classifies coal as a critical mineral, you hold them accountable. Do you want to continue propagating death in the name of bringing electricity while you have the endless sunlight and wind and water that can generate the same electricity? What is it really you are seeking because of this? And moving forward also, it's important that we also appreciate that there's a shrinking space for independent journalism, especially among commercial newsrooms. And now NGOs need to come forward and fund us to really, really give money to independent media houses.
Yeah.
That is why the elephant can cover the stories the way they do. That is why Mongabe can be as bold as well. That is why in Kenya, African censor John Allan Namu can name names and really go. And we all know why John Allan Namu left. He couldn't tell some of the stories that he could tell in a commercial media house. So I think independent journalism is the next frontier as commercial leaders in Europe try and sort out the financial, because at the end of the day, they do need money to move, but you cannot be accepting money from the people who are destroying the continent. We need to find other revenue streams. And unfortunately, in countries like Kenya, the government, which was also supposed to be a critical part of it, is financially throttling them in order to take care of that independence, which is very pesky and inconvenient when they're trying to be corrupt.
Okay, after years of reporting across the continent, right, are you more hopeful or more anxious about Africa's environmental future?
This is a two-pronged question. First, I am sad.
Okay.
I am discombobulated, which is a term.
We can use that too.
I had to use it somewhere because everybody uses it. But it's because we look at the new Scramble for Africa and how extractivism is still taking center stage and how neo-colonialism is leading to far more injustices and far more displacement and all the injustices we've continued complaining about. So that makes me sad that even as we have realized the effects of climate change and that fossil fuels are the reasons why we are here, and that now the solution for us to power our industries without fossil fuels, we are still giving concessions to these countries where they have been blocked in their own places from doing that extraction, but now they have come to Africa because our laws are weak and our politicians can be compromised. That makes me sad. What makes me hopeful is that we now in a generation that really is standing up and telling people, no, we are not going to allow this. Which is why, for instance, in Kenya, through litigation and activism, we were able to overturn the Seed and Plant Varieties Act. And it was declared sections of it that threatened to jail these women, that told them you cannot share these seeds and you need to get licensed, unconstitutional. We should be celebrating that. But now you hear the government has given notice, is going to appeal that decision. So then whose interests are you serving? But more importantly, going forward in terms of storytelling, we see even in South Africa where the fights against fossil fuels and shale has been stopped. And I think last year during the Africa Energy Week, which we call Africa Exploitation Week, because that's the annual gathering of fossil fuel enthusiasts, the energy minister Gwadimantashe said that they lose around $6 billion of investment every year because of fossil fuels as a result of activism. And I was like, yes, it seems we are doing something. So Africa will only lose the moment we keep quiet. As long as people continue raising their voices and speaking out and standing for justice and supporting frontline communities, there is more hope than despair.
Okay.
If we look out east in terms of what China does visiting Africa, in a manner that didn't really happen when we talk about colonialism.
Yes.
But now we're looking at, of course, the new frontiers in colonialism and the extractive nature of would-be friends of development. How would you look at the impact that China's need for geopolitical strength has played out on Africa's resources?
We generally live in a global village where we all welcome partnerships. But when the partnership is lopsided, that is where the problem is. And there's a huge debate about the role of the China's road and bridge project they have. Is a massive project, and we've seen what happens. Unfortunately, as we've learned Kenyans, the lessons with the SGR is sometimes the governments, and this comes confessions later, that China will give you more expensive loans but without accountability that you can take from the other place. And so if they're willing to look away at corruption and so on in the name of sovereignty, but then they tie you down to debts which then we are forced to pay, then we have to ask ourselves questions. When Chinese trawlers come to the Indian Oceans and flout every international law on the sea to troll and damage the fishing, then we need to ask ourselves, really, are they Chinese friends, or does this friendship come also with the new form of Eastern colonialism? And also, even as we try and bring the West to come and to balance it, but what concessions have we make? The thing is, Africa is consistently fighting from a point of disadvantage. Even the tax laws, and that's why we have now the UN Tax Convention to change. The OECD countries are the ones who control the tax. So countries like corporations like Total and can mine here, but all that profits go back. Total will take the profits to France, Shell will take the profits to the UK, and we can't even tax them properly. And that really needs to change. That if you're going to take resources from Africa, you need to pay for it. But most importantly, what I believe is that those who are responsible for the damage must pay for it. And that's why we have these laws like extended the EPRs, extended producer responsibility, that we need to put in place and to action, so that if a organization like Coca-Cola and Nestle, and I'm mentioning them because annual plastics audits that have been done, I've consistently placed them as the most vulgar producers of single-use plastic which is soaking the planet. I think the rate now is 200,000 single-use plastic bottles an hour. So when you produce that and dump it on the market, and then you want the waste pickers of Dandora to be responsible for that recycling, which accounts for less than 10% of the overall recycling, we say, no, this is exploitation. You need to go back to refill and reuse systems.
Right.
But for this to be implemented, we need to have this plastics treaty, which, by the way, fossil companies and the companies developing fossil have been blocking. That's why INC keeps on going on and going on.
Yeah.
And I hope it doesn't turn into another COP. And governments like Kenya, when you say you want to block single-use plastic and you succeed, but all your neighbors don't do that, it means that plastic still finds its way into Kenya.
Exactly.
So there has to be a collective decision-making to say, this is what you want to do, this is the direction you have to take, and this is what you must do to make this happen. There are efforts to do that, but unfortunately, you will always find that one person that
who's compromised.
Is compromised, and that torpedoes the whole thing, because in international agreements, you all have to say yes.
Absolutely.
And getting 196 people to say yes.
It's a bit tough.
That's tough.
Right.
So, just to bring this to a close, 10 years from now, and you've actually alluded it to, sort of, 10 years from now, what determines whether, climate becomes Africa's destabilizer,
Yes.
or whether it becomes a catalyst for structural reform?
As it is right now, it is already a destabilizer.
Okay.
Because we are seeing the floods and hurricanes in Mozambique. We are seeing the drought in Kenya. Kenya alone already, the government announced that 3 million people already must be fed for them to survive. And we need to reverse that trend. We agreed at the Paris Agreement that we need to cut down production of fossil fuels. So to feed our energy needs, we need investments in coal, in renewable energy, do away with coal, oil, and gas, and take advantage of the sun, the wind, and water. Once we start that transition, it means that we're getting new investments. And research also shows that renewable energy actually creates 6 times more jobs than fossil fuels, because you have to train people to put them up, and you have to put people to maintain this. And once that level of equity comes in, then it starts changing. In our adaptation needs, the international community, as they have agreed, the people who benefited most need to fund our adaptation needs so that we can anticipate. Listen, California can predict a hurricane 3 months before it happens.
Indeed, yeah.
Move, and people move. I will be driving home. I get there, and what happened to my home? I can't get there. So we are still, that's why there's adaptation and mitigation. They've already learned their lessons. They just say, how do we prevent this from happening? Here we're just saying, how do we survive first? We are in survival mode. And once we step out of that, then we'll be able to resolve it. Because listen, carbon dioxide takes up to 1,000 years to disappear. The closest it will take is 100 years, which means that even if we did away with all the carbon right now, we will still feel these effects up to a century from now. So none of us will be alive.
You still have to deal with methane as well.
And methane as well, which is 80 times worse than carbon.
Yeah.
Only that it takes about 12 years to oxidize.
Yeah.
So when you look at that, then you understand why we are fighting so hard, because sustainability, which I spoke about, when it was defined in 1987, you need to use resources right now and make decisions that make sure that the people that come after you will not be affected by the decisions you make right now. But the current decisions you're making right now are definitely going to affect our sons and daughters, and we need to make sure that their sons and the grandsons do not suffer as a result of what we are doing, and that right now is not taking place. There is hope. We are taking action. We are standing up to them, and we hope that with time, if we empower these communities and do the right thing, the global north, the global south, and come together and decide it is time to put people and the planet before profit, then the future will be great.
Brilliant.
Ferdinand, what a wonderful way to actually conclude that. It's great to have you on panel 54.
It's a great pleasure.
We need to extend this conversation at some point down the line. But as always, wonderful to have you here.
Thanks for having me, and this was a very important conversation to have, and I hope the message spreads out and people really see what we're trying to do. So these stories must be told so that we change the world and live in a better place.
For sure. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Climate is not just about temperature. It's about territory, power, water, minerals, migration, legitimacy.
We explored how environmental stress morphs into security crisis, how extraction can promise development while deepening vulnerability, and how governance gaps turn natural shocks into political instability.
We also asked who controls the narrative, because storytelling shapes policy and policy shapes lives.
If Africa's environmental future is to look different from its extractive past, change will not come from rhetoric. It will come from enforcement, sovereignty, and institutional courage. You've been listening to Panel 54, where we rethink the world one African perspective at a time. If it made you pause, reflect, or reframe, share it, start a conversation, and tag us in. Find us on our social media handles at Panel 54 and your favorite streaming platform. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode.
Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember to keep the lens clear. Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens.